You have this little piece of time, one night, in a conflict that went for 5 years. Just this one night. But it was enough to plant a seed in people's minds that things could be and maybe should be different.
It's a fragment of sheer humanity during 4 years of sheer inhumanity.
The Christmas truce stood as an ideal embodiment of compromise, one moment of peace in a desolate time of war. Soldiers in opposing trenches put down their arms and made a compromise to stop firing in the name of shared values, even in the face of danger. On June 28, 1914, the frail establishment of peace in Europe fell apart. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia, asking for a multitude of humiliating demands. Serbia, after consideration, refused. Austro-Hungarian officials signed a declaration of war. Due to a large entanglement of alliances, the war would end up involving Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria on one side, with Serbia, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, and the United States opposing them. The warring nations quickly mobilized their forces in preparation for blood in Europe. By the end of the war, approximately 17 million men were buried in the depths of the trenches, sand, and no man's land. The Christmas Truce, a moment of peace in an endless war.
Over 99 years after its conclusion, World War I is still notorious for its battlefront between the nations of France and Germany. The Western Front is, even to this day, a symbol of dread for any soldier in the French, British, or German armies. Many deadly forms of military technology were tested there, such as tanks and toxic gases. By far the deadliest front of the war, the Western Front quickly inflicted casualties on both sides. This was far from what was expected by either alliance. One promise that was widespread throughout the European continent was a concept of peace and the return home by Christmas. After 5 months, Christmas Eve arrived, along with disappointment in the trenches. Waking up on Christmas Eve, many soldiers were in a state of denial.
Everybody's homesick. They all thought they'd be home by the first Christmas, and they're not. Instead, they're in these muddy trenches. People are sick, and they don't want to be there. They want to be home.
While soldiers were still struggling with the prospect of years of fighting, they prepared for Christmas. Christmas Eve marked a moment that would never be forgotten by those who participated in it. After preparing Christmas decorations on their side of the land, the Germans sat down to celebrate the holiday. Besides the war, this Christmas was perfect. The damp ground froze into a white landscape, and lights illuminated the night sky. In many trenches, the sound of German hymns rang throughout the air. The English responded, and each side continued to sing. In a few songs, the Germans stumbled upon Still Nacht, or Silent Night. The British recognized the tune and joined the Germans. They both sang in unison, and for one moment, the war was suspended. Their bloody fight was set aside as a symbol of hope, one which the soldiers would keep in their hearts until the end of the war. This wasn't the only act of brotherhood between the soldiers on Christmas Eve. Carols could be heard across many trenches. However, besides this, in most sections of the Western Front, Christmas Eve brought nothing but trench routines. This day was one that, by tradition, was one of the most joyful celebrations of the year. However, it was practically no different from any other day. That night, most soldiers slept with no excitement for the holiday. On Christmas Day, many areas of the Western Front saw curious soldiers popping their heads over the side. In certain trenches across the front, not a single shot was fired. On a few separate occasions, the Germans stood up and waved from the trenches, and the British did the same. It wasn't long before men from both sides met in the center of no man's land, exchanging gifts and conversation. The opposing soldiers acted as friends there, both acknowledging the hardship and losses of the war. The most famous example of fraternization during the Christmas truce was a soccer match in no man's land. The two sides organized a friendly game which ultimately led to a German victory of 3-2. The soccer match showed neither talent nor competition, just a reminder of a time when bloodshed was unnecessary. After lining up helmets and planks of wood from the trenches, the game they played stood as a reminder of a joy that they had at home. Christmas Day came and went. At the end of the day, with their spirits not fading, the troops went back to their trenches for rest. It wouldn't be long before High Command learned of the events on Christmas. Generals felt extremely apprehensive at the thought of a ceasefire. Because most of the soldiers had been drafted into what was supposed to be a quick series of battles, High Command knew their want to return home. Neither alliance followed up on the promise to their soldiers that they'd be able to return home by Christmas. They knew that any sort of fraternization could remind the soldiers of home, triggering a new unwillingness to fight in the war. The generals had been fighting for nothing short of absolute victory. All military personnel had been warned against communicating with the opposition during the outbreak of the war. Both sides called for disciplinary action against soldiers and officers alike, threatening them to enact court-martial as punishment. While these threats never amounted and no soldier or officer was punished, the general's threats had the intended effect. Meanwhile, multiple attempts of peace did not end as well as hoped. In many sections of the Western Front, fighting continued. Both sides suffered casualties as a result of the advancements in ambushes. Because news of the Christmas truce did not reach all parts of the front, some soldiers who attempted to enact the truce were shot down immediately. The failed attempts to establish a truce made sides more wary of partaking in such endeavors, and the Christmas truce was halted in its tracks. News of these events began to circulate throughout the trenches. As a result, soldiers became more worrisome during the truce, especially when conferring with the enemy in no man's land. Even so, many would still refuse to fire for the next coming days. But as Christmas truce passed, so did the unofficial truce the soldiers had risked their lives to enact. Many officers would forcefully convince sides to continue fighting. In one area of the Western Front, a British officer was concerned about the fraternization and the consequences which would follow. Seeing his troops still fraternizing with the enemy days after Christmas, he confronted one of his men about it. When the soldier confirmed the truce continued, the officer took a gun and shot an enemy soldier as he stood in no man's land. Both sides' soldiers scattered back to their respective trenches, and the war resumed.
And in some cases after a couple of hours, in some cases the next day, and in other cases, in a few rare cases, some days later, the fighting just resumed.
It was an amazing spectacle, and must arouse bitter thoughts concerning those high-ranking conspirators against the peace of the world, who in their mad ambition had hounded such men to take each other by the throat rather than by the hand. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
So it came to be that men, tired of fighting, wanting to go home and see their families again, returned to battle. No matter how violently the truce ended, all parts of the Western Front resumed fighting in a matter of days. After the Christmas truce, the bloodshed would not cease until November 11th, 1918. Standing as the only major truce in World War I, this time was a monumental moment of peace during war.
I think it's important because of the moral dimension of it, showing that if you leave people, even soldiers, even trained military men, and in 1914 most of them were professionals and not just volunteers, professional soldiers, that if you leave them in particular circumstances, they will naturally long for peace.
Despite the suddenness of the event, a truce between the alliances was not in the least a new idea. Pope Benedict XV had called for a truce earlier, but both sides utterly ignored the suggestion and did not advertise the idea. The sides were entranced by their hunger for victory and stopped at nothing to achieve it. The war would eventually utilize advanced military technology such as poisonous gas, gaining advantages in the battlefield at the cost of millions of lives. Even long after the war, the impact of the Christmas truce has never faded. The last soldier to participate in the truce, Alfred Anderson, died in November of 2005. However, the legacy both he and his comrades left serves as a reminder of the goodness in humanity and the strong urge for peace in the world. In John McCutcheon's ballad, Christmas in the Trenches, he wrote, "The ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame, and on each end of the rifle we're the same." Since its occurrence, museums, statues, and memorials have been dedicated to this event. While the Christmas truce never had any long-term political effects or an effect on the war those soldiers fought, it changed the lives of the men forever. It was a light that helped them realize why they were fighting. They weren't fighting for political gain. They were fighting for their home.
So yes, maybe this truce only lasted for a number of hours, but its effect is still being felt over 100 years later.
Because of this, the Christmas truce will be remembered by the governments of the world as a time when the soldiers rebelled against their country. But the soldiers will remember it as a time when they momentarily quelled the rebellion the government had against its people. The Christmas truce of 1914 showed the world much needed faith in a time of conflict, and will stand out to us as one of the most genuine and heartfelt cases of compromise among fighting forces in human history.